Hi, this is Mike Nemeth, Marketing and Communications Director for the California Apartment Association. Earlier this week, I had the privilege of interviewing Whitney Prout, CAA's Legal and Compliance Counsel, about Senate Bill 466, which was an attack on the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, which is California's most important rental housing protection law. It would have allowed cities and counties to impose their rent control laws on much newer housing. In fact, rental housing in Los Angeles, San Francisco, and San Jose, built in the 1980s, would have soon been eligible for local rent control had SB 466 moved forward. A few hours after we did the interview, I learned that CAA had defeated this bill for the year. A thank you goes out to all of our members who wrote to their senators or called them urging them to vote no on this anti-housing bill. With the defeat of 466, that means housing that is currently protected from rent control under the new construction exemption will stay that way, at least for now. But that's not to say that the Costa-Hawkins Act is safe. A statewide ballot measure is expected to qualify for the November 2024 general election that would repeal Costa-Hawkins in its entirety. So it's as important as ever for rental housing providers throughout California to understand the Costa-Hawkins Act and how it protects their investments. So I'd like to share a part of my interview with Whitney Prout where she unpacks Costa-Hawkins. Let's have a look.
So the Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act is a law that the California state legislature adopted in the 1990s. And at its heart, what it does is it puts some guardrails around what local governments can do in terms of enacting and enforcing rent control. And it really serves as a hedge against the strictest forms of rent control. It does that in three ways. The first is that it says owners are entitled to what is known as vacancy decontrol, which is a really clunky way of saying that they get to reset the rent to market levels when the unit turns over. So when you have a vacancy, even if the rents have been kept artificially low under the local rent control ordinance, you can reset that rent to market after your tenant voluntarily vacates. So that's the first way. The second way is that it exempts certain types of properties from local rent control altogether. And those are single family homes and condos, what are known as separately alienable units. Again, really clunky term. And then it also exempts certain buildings based on when they were first constructed. And exactly how that plays out varies a little bit based on where in the state it is. But the idea is it sets a point in time and says if your property was built before this date, it could potentially be subject to local rent control. And if it was built after a certain date, it's not. What we see in Costa-Hawkins is that it breaks down what is considered new construction into two different buckets. The first bucket is for the cities and theoretically counties that had rent control in place already when Costa-Hawkins was adopted. And I think the best way to think about it is that it essentially froze those new construction exemptions that already existed in those local laws at the time, sort of put them in SAP. And it said those have to stay where they are. So for example, in places like the city of Los Angeles, their rent control ordinance in the 1990s already said if a property was built after 1978, it was exempt from the local rent control ordinances, whereas pre-1978 properties could be covered. Costa-Hawkins in that instance said, okay, Los Angeles, you have to keep your 1978 new construction exemption. You can't let that date move forward later in time. And then the other bucket of sort of new construction definition in Costa-Hawkins was for anywhere that didn't have local rent control when the law was adopted, that didn't have local rent control already in the mid 1990s. And it said for those places, you cannot, if you enact rent control later, apply your local rent control ordinance to properties that were issued a certificate of occupancy. And I'll talk in a second about what that is. But essentially, if it was constructed after Costa-Hawkins was adopted, and it specifically calls out the date of February 1st, 1995. So it's that 1995 date that tends to govern in places that adopted rent control more recently, and in places that adopted rent control a longer time ago, it's that more frozen in time definition of whatever was in the local ordinance pre-Costa-Hawkins.